Good afternoon, everyone. The Washington Center for the Book is an affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, and it's administered by the Washington State Library where I work. So every state and territory in the U.S. has a Center for the Book. And today's event was made possible by a grant, the John Cole and Nancy Gwynn grant that we applied for, and it was issued to us through the Library of Congress. So the Washington Center for the Book promotes literacy and a love of books, reading, and libraries. We celebrate Washington's robust literary heritage and shine a spotlight on the contribution of reading and libraries in strengthening communities and in fostering civic engagement. And one of our biggest projects in the year is the Washington State Book Awards, which have been around in one form or another since the late 1960s. And Red Paint, the ancestral autobiography of a Coast Salish punk, won the 2023 Washington State Book Award for creative nonfiction memoir. So it's an honor to be here with you today and to have the opportunity to introduce Sasha taqʷšəblu LaPointe. LaPointe is from Upper Skagit and Nooksack Indian tribes. Native to the Pacific Northwest, she draws inspiration from her coastal heritage as well as her life in the city. She writes with a focus on trauma and resilience, ranging topics from PTSD, sexual violence, the work her great-grandmother did for the Lushootseed language revitalization, to loud basement punk shows and what it means to grow up mixed heritage. With strange obsessions revolving around Twin Peaks, the Seattle music scene, and Coast Salish salmon ceremonies, Sasha explores her own truth of Indigenous identity in the Coast Salish territory. Her collection of essays, Thunder Song, was recently released on March 5th, and her book of poetry, Rose Quartz, is also available here today. So there'll be a signing after the talk and Q&A. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sasha taqʷšəblu LaPointe. Oh, it's always weird when I can't have water somewhere because I drink a lot of water. It's okay, I'll figure it out. So. Oh my gosh, thank you. Thanks. I always joke about reading or when I do readings, having to drink so much water. It's always a little awkward because it's like I take a lot of water breaks because I get nervous, dry mouth. Okay, we're in it together. You're going to see me drink a lot of water. It's maybe kind of intimate and strange, but here we are. Gwalapu, Chaltu, CIA, taqʷšəblu, Seedsta, Nooksack, Skagit. Hello, welcome everyone. It's an honor to be here with you all, and share space. My name is Sasha taqʷšəblu LaPointe, and I'm from Nooksack in Upper Skagit. And I have a medley of things to read you guys today and talk to you about. So hopefully that's okay. I guess I want to start. I'll read some things and then we can have a Q&A and talk. But in thinking about coming here today, I was really grateful. Thank you so much for hosting me. It means a lot. Whenever I get to, as a Coast Salish woman, come to other Native communities, it's honestly what soothes my soul and reminds me why it's important that we do the work that we do as writers, as artists, just putting our voices out there. And also, real talk, I just got off. I flew home last night. What is time? From Denver. I've been on a tour with a dear friend. So I'm a little exhausted. My roommate actually clocked me when I was leaving this morning. They were like, "You usually have more makeup on," and I was like, "Rude." I was like, "I'm tired." But I believe in honesty and good communication. So you are receiving me as a very exhausted little husk of a human, but in a good way. So I'm happy to be here with y'all. Thank you. So I wanted to talk about, my journey, in general, Red Paint, made, I think it's impossible to talk about this tour I just came off of last night without talking about Red Paint being in the world and how grateful I am that it became a thing that other folks can read and engage with. And then also, of course, the award. I don't know if I would, have been able to do the things I just did for a couple of weeks without this. So I feel like a big gratitude
in my heart. And so I want to start with reading a little bit from that, and then also talk more about this tour that I did with an incredible, one of my dear friends. We jokingly call ourselves sister wives. We're basically in friend love, but her name is taqʷšəblu. She's a Maori poet who is visiting right now from New Zealand and has a book out. And we got to do all these events together and said bye on the terrible airport train. Wow, I had no idea the Denver airport was like a city. Thank you. I was like, am I freaking out? It's huge too. And we didn't expect that. We were just like, okay, cool. We're getting there an hour and a half early. And then all of a sudden we were like, this is a ginormous, we got lost several times. But long story short, we ended up having to say, and this is a dear friend, sister wife, close. She's a relative. We had to say bye to each other on that train. She was like, oh, wait, I'm at Concourse B. And I was like, I'm at Concourse C. Wait, aren't these right next to each other? And she was like, no. And yesterday afternoon, we just embraced and both cried publicly and was like, bye. So I'll talk about that more. But I will start with a little bit of red paint first. And I promise this will all make sense and be cohesive. I think part of what was really important for us as friends, as two Indigenous women, being offered the opportunity to come share our words, really, every night we were emotional. Every night we're in a new place and sharing our story and having questions. And every night we felt this kind of exhaustion, but in a good way, where it's people are listening, people are this is beautiful. And we were talking about where we're both from. And I think it's really important. It's hard to, wow. I was so good the night before. Last night was my last event and I was very eloquent, but right now I'm oh, the exhaustion is kicking in. But we were talking about the importance of place and where we're from, and how even though where she grew up is across an ocean, that ocean is like a highway between our two cultures that our ancestors traveled back and forth. But to honor that place where we're from, because again, going back to red paint, it's wild to me that this was able to be created and put into the world, and people were interested enough to pay attention to my story. And so starting at, I'm just going to read a little bit from Naming Ceremony, and then I'm going to move on. It's like a mixtape, a medley, a weird compilation of things that I'm going to share with y'all. But I want to start with Naming Ceremony. There's a photograph of me at the naming ceremony, small in a blue dress, mess of brown ringlets falling around my face as I teeter precariously close to the edge of the picnic table. The photo was taken in 1986. I am 3 years old. My arm is outstretched as if reaching for someone out of frame, and I'm smiling. I'd like to think it was my great-grandmother, just out of reach, coming to gather her namesake up in her arms, but there's no way of knowing. It could have been my mother. It could have been anybody. I have white socks with ruffles and strappy shoes. You can tell from the photo that my mother wanted me to look nice. You can also tell by the grin on my face that moments after the photo was taken, I would be barefoot, that my dress would be streaked in grass stains. When remembering that day, my mother sighs, laughs a little, and says, I looked across the yard, saw you on the table dancing next to the boombox, and I just knew you were going to be a handful. That day, relatives passed me along in their arms, as uncles tended to the fire, as the salmon baked. Friends and family tousled my hair, pinched my cheeks, and said things like, taqʷšəblu #2, and what hard shoes to fill. I like to think that my great-grandmother knew what she was doing that day, that she knew the counter curse I would someday need. Like the fairy godmother in Sleeping Beauty, who saved her gift for last and passed to the sleeping princess the only thing that could wake her. As a child, I would long for what princesses possessed: magic, courage, enchanted slippers, and the love of brave princes. I would come to yearn for new worlds and new ways to escape. What I wouldn't realize was the power that was bestowed upon me that day, the magic my great-grandmother passed down, and it wasn't true love's kiss. It wasn't a prince. It wasn't a spell or a slipper. It was a name, taqʷšəblu, like an incantation, taqʷšəblu. It comes from deep in me, travels through parted lips out into the world and stays there. I wanted to start with that. First of many water breaks. I told you it's kind of weird. Like, just wait till one day when you take a sip of water in front of a room full of strangers. But I wanted to start with that because what on this tour, Tay and I were talking about so much is like really honoring where you're from and being proud of that. And to me, that is like the origin, the start. And I'm proud of that. So I'm going to move on to, let's see. I actually have, so I kind of want to give you guys a glimpse into what this tour was like. Like Tay and I met a couple years ago randomly, like our agents put us in touch and said, we want you guys to do a reading together in Seattle. And this was 2 years ago. And we said, okay. But then we met and it was like, oh my gosh, like I had never, like, it was such an immediate kindred spirit. And I think Tay was on book tour for her first collection and was like, I have to go back to LA. And after we did this Portland Book Festival, she ended up writing me and said, I don't want to go back to LA. Can I just come back to Tacoma with you? And I was like, have you been to Tacoma? It's not LA, but like, so she ended up, and it was beautiful. She changed her flight. She had a whole hotel booked and she was like, you know, didn't have events, but was like, I'm supposed to go stay in LA for a week and I don't want to. So instead she came and stayed with me and we bonded a lot. And it was really beautiful. And we both talked about the importance of kinship and connection and meeting each other, especially as like emerging authors in the literary world and as Indigenous women. Like it's challenging sometimes. And so for every night of this tour, we did this kind of back and forth. This is also, I'm sorry, just me missing her so much. This is the first event I've done since we parted ways. But we did this really cool back and forth where I shared a poem, I shared a chapter. She, you know, we would kind of, and our work was in conversation with each other. So I'll read one of the poems that her and I were doing our back and forth thing with. This is called Cedar Woven Dress at Seattle Art Museum. And I guess a little bit of backstory on this. There is an exhibit at SAM that I would go visit. I mean, I often go just see it. It's a dress that my great-grandmother by taqʷšəblu Hilbert wore and donated it. And I go see it and I have pictures of her in it. I remember her in it. And it's really strange to like see that in a glass case, like something you can't touch. And this poem is about that. Oh my gosh, how unique. Oh my God, this is one of my students from the Native Pathways program. I'm so happy you're here. Thank you for being here. Cedar Woven Dress at Seattle Art Museum. The year I'm born, they carve a maiden from the trunk of an ancient tree. My grandmother does the blessing, dressed in cedar, hands to the sky, feet in the tide, palms up, palms full of story. The maiden marries the sea, becomes ocean and sea kelp for him, a promise of fish returning, a union of abundance to keep her people from starving. I am born lonely, an inheritance of grief and wanting, muscle memory of seashell, and the fear of ever going hungry. For years, we swap the story. I watch the bones of her cheeks as they sink and star into barnacle. Everything dies eventually. I say it out loud, to an empty gallery, words echoing museum white against a glass case encased inside the dress, cedar woven and donated. Every day I present to the shape of her my accomplishments, everything I've ever done, an offering, pages, heartbreaks, trophies, degrees, awards, a stillborn. The display creates an illusion of body, ghost-like, the form filling up with nothing. I punch my fist through the glass as the alarm begins its screaming, and the people come running from the beach up the stairs to see me torn apart and bleeding, skin shredded, knuckles cut open and sparkling as they splinter like rubies in the glass. And I drag myself through the broken opening, clothing ripped, body gutted and glistening like fish. What's left is practically nothing, skeletal, bone wet and shining. I crawl inside and the people are surprised when I don't slip into it. The dress, the cedar woven shape of her. They don't understand I never intended to fill it. Instead, a body cut like a promise, blood ribboning. I curl into her would-be arms, like a baby, like I used to be. The memory of being held by something, like oceans, like language, like story, like grandmothers and whales and maidens who give themselves up freely to the deep to keep their people from ever going hungry. Oh my gosh, thank you. Thanks. Aw. Water. Again, and I hope that you guys can kind of piece together the connections between, I just wished Hay was here. This back and forth was really about story and about our story and our Indigenous voices and how important it is to be in this world, even though it's challenging for us sometimes. So I have enough time, and we'll have time for Q&A too. But I have one more poem, and then also Tay just had her essay published, and I want to share like the tiniest excerpt. I also think it's badass when writers come up and they're like, I'm going to share someone else's work. I'm like, yes. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do the thing that I love to see. But the last poem I'll share is, and also these are new poems, which is so scary for me. So thank you for letting me be vulnerable. I thought I would read from rose quartz, but I'm not. These are new things. But that week that Tay spent with me, one of her last nights, we ended up going to a documentary screening at the Egyptian Theater in Seattle. And it was really cool because I got this random email that they were like, hey, we would love to invite you. And I was like, this feels so bougie. Like, I just got invited to something. Do you want to, I get a +1. It was like really cool. And so we went, and it's a really beautiful documentary, the Salmon People documentary. We both got emotional, we both cried, and afterwards I was like, we're in Seattle, I'm gonna take you down, we're gonna do something super silly and bougie and go to Ivar's. And she was like, what is that? And I was like, it's like where like tourists go, it's like right on the waterfront, Pike Place Market, we're gonna get like $60 entrees, it's gonna be ridiculous. And we were really excited. We went all the way there. It was closed. And I was like, I felt like such a failure. I was like, oh no. And we ended up getting yelled at by a security guard, which was wild. So I wrote a poem about that and sent it to her a couple days after she left. Did you guys know too that the Ivers in Pike Place, like they have like this big neon sign that just says acres of clams. And when I saw that, I was like, it's hilarious and weird. So acres of clams for taqʷšəblu. On Pier 54, we ran against the cold, clenched our fists, red claws pierced palms as we sprinted just to get here, where white tourists come to eat fish. That's the wrong one. Yikes. Thank you for being so kind. Here we go. This is the right one. I was only home for like less than 24 hours. My roommates were all like, I was getting ready to go and they were like, "You're leaving again?" And I was like, "Yep." Acres of clams for taqʷšəblu. On Pier 54, we ran against the cold, clenched our fists, red claws like a chokehold as we sprinted just to get here where white tourists come to eat fish. Because it's all for us, isn't it? Femme fatale, dressed to kill an indigenous, showing skin in black latex and scarlet lipstick. I promised you an expensive view of the water. But we arrived too late, bare thighs in mini skirts quaking against closed gates. How long has it been that we have forgotten where we come from? The protocols, the drumming, and we left that documentary practically running down the hill towards paid parking, towards overpriced Pinot Grigio, and all the lights twinkling neon on the Salish Sea. Instead, a security guard in his rented authority speaking so sternly, "You can't be here. The boardwalk closes at 9. So I took your hand in mine and we stilettoed our way up the harbor steps to the only place that was open to us. 1,000 Spirits was a bust, a glass tank of drunk men, thirsty, crazy with lust. And when one of them reached out to touch your hair, I swear to God, we almost dropped him right there in front of the hostess. How we longed to bring him to his knees and not in any way he may have wanted. The place was crowded, the men leering, our plates lacking in salmon and overall disappointing. Still, we swallowed bland entrees, scraped forks against porcelain, complained to the waitress about watered down drinks, deep down knowing it was fish we were craving, how we wished for something else, something more celebratory. We deserve a party, don't we? A feast our ancestors could deem worthy. So we drove home quiet, bellies empty. And the next morning when you left, I was still hungry, was so lonely because something was missing. Now you're across an ocean, mouth full of oysters, and we're sharing stories. And I came back to the restaurant on the boardwalk to eat a meal meant for both of us. Salmon and wild huckleberry, a glass of white wine, and I told the waiter, yeah, it's just me, and yeah, keep that breadbasket coming. Because I want to get filled up, so stuffed it hurts to feel my skirt cutting into me. But I overheard the waiter talking to the other table. Get the halibut, the salmon is too fishy. The fucking nerve of this man who doesn't understand the restaurant was built over tide flats, covered abundance and buried sacred places where once my ancestors harvested everything they ever needed. Now this waiter, white as my wine, tells a different history. Tray in his hand as he stands on salmon people land, going on and on about the restaurant's namesake, how the place rose up in the 30s, the dream of a Swedish folk singer who started it from the ground up, built a seafood empire out of nothing. Did you know his first hustle was a sideshow? Captured creatures from the Salish Sea, Seattle's first aquarium. He charged a nickel to view, and as the people queued, he discovered another opportunity because his patrons were hungry. And I remember us dressed up and pretty, skin slick wet and glittering with rain, how thirsty the men were for it, eyes slack, eyes starving, how we had become sea anemone and starfish for them to drop a nickel in. Did it feel good, I wonder, to deny us our entry? And when the check comes, I'm full but still hungry, still missing something, your smile, your teeth, your hands, how tall we can be when we stand together, how we would have howled with laughter in this waiter's face at this stupid place. And the name is what finally breaks me. The neon flickering, the buzzing sign glowing too pink and bright in my eyes. I pushed against the door's weight, had to use my entire body just to leave this place and its empty plate behind me. Out on the pier, I hear the waves raging. Beneath stars, I listen for you as I curl fingers into fists, as I wish for your hand. Remember how we ran and ran just to be here. One of my favorite things about Che and I's connection was we kept having these similarities. Like we'd be somewhere, we'd see something, and she'd be like, "Oh, you know, in Maori culture, it's this way," and I'm like, "Oh, in my culture, it's this way." And there was a lot of overlap that she, for those of you who have read the book, or it's very clear. I have an obsession with we both share an obsession of the Little Mermaid, but also water deities, water spirits, water legends. And she shared with me one of hers when I was telling her about the Maiden of Deception Path. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, we also had a maiden that married the sea." I was like, "Of course you did." And I wish she was here to say it better, but her tribe story is Panya. And Panya fell in love with a chief's son, and he wanted to keep her on land. And the rule was, the thing was, they could be together, but every night she had to go back or every morning she had to go back into the sea. And so this worked for a while, where they were in love, they'd be able to spend, you know, some time together. But eventually he got kind of jealous and kind of like, what, just stay. And his friends were always like, "You have this badass babe, but like, where is she? Does she even exist, bro? Come on." And so he tried to trick her one night. He went to one of their medicine workers and got like was told if you feed her cooked human food, she would have to be stuck on land forever. But she wised up to it. Something in her spirit told her, "I'm not going to eat this." And so she abandoned him, and they never saw each other again. So I'll just read like a very short excerpt from this, but please check out Tate Tipple's work. It's so, so beautiful. I tell Sasha about Panya as we down oyster shooters and eat salmon in an upstairs bar called Sirens that overlooks the sea. Sasha tells me about her own sea maiden of Deception Pass, how instead of dissolving into a reef, becomes seaweed. She tells me her people are protected by orcas, and I tell her my ancestors survived being thrown off of the waka and left to die by his jealous brother by pulling up to Atura on the back of a whale. Spirit animal, she says, and I give her our word for it. We bond over being obsessed with the Little Mermaid when we were little, forever forcing the tape into our grandmother's VCR. We bond over a lot of things. We bond over an ocean. Sasha takes me to her creative writing class at Evergreen State College in Olympia. I'm obsessed with the campus drowned by walls of green pines. Before class, we smoke with her boss, Dawn, and a student called Wyatt on a little landing at the top of the steps. We're smoking and cracking jokes, and when I feel a tap on my shoulder, I turn around. And in the distance, I see a carved house. But it's not a longhouse, or is it? I hesitate. No, it's one of our houses. I recognize our carvings, the specific way we shape our ancestors out of wood. I point it out. "That's Maori," I say. Wyatt takes us down to the house. He is the longhouse intern, and he has a set of keys. The house was designed by Lionel Grant in collaboration with the Coast Salish carvers. Sasha and I admire the traditional Maori carvings next to the traditional Salish po. There's an inscription on the house that flows from Te Rora to Lashutsi, the Maori language. I put an arm around Sasha and laugh and tell her, this building is so me and you. And I think that this is really beautiful and blows my mind. We both were like, what? How did this happen? I'll just read one excerpt from this essay and then we'll open it up to questions. But when, after that week we spent together, we both wrote twin essays and without talking to each other. It was wild. I remember going to see our editor and I was like, oh, I have this essay about me and Tay going down to Swan Creek in Tacoma and doing this and that. And she was like, oh yeah, I've read it. Tay wrote the same thing. And I was like, what? And it would truly, that you will see. I can find it. Why do they always disappear when you need them? This is why bookmarks are so important. So this is the last essay in my new book, Hunger Song. And it is called Kinships. And it's in two parts. The first is called Habu. The second is called Canoe Journey. Because another thing that Tay and I have in common is coming from canoe people, and we bonded over that. And my uncle let us come to a canoe he was working on and sit in it, and we took pictures. We felt like posers. We weren't actually in the water, but it was really beautiful. Thomas is here. Okay. And I guess one other little tidbit. I spend a lot of time in Hawaii because my partner grew up there on the Big Island, and that's also really intense for me. My great-grandmother went to the Big Island throughout her life working on language, and she went to Hilo constantly. So it's been really beautiful and amazing to go follow her footsteps and see the places that she went, even including this little duck pond called Mio's. It was her favorite place in Hilo, which was close to the university she did her work at. So part 2, Canoe Journey. On my most recent trip to the Big Island, I sat on a beach while my partner surfed. He had left me a snorkel mask and encouraged me to swim out along the reef if I got too hot, saying there were most likely sea turtles out at this time of day. Instead, I sat in the blistering heat, notebook in my lap as I filled its pages with poetry. I wrote about the small blue church ahead of me, how it seemed out of place at the water's edge. I wrote about the duck pond at Mio's, about how when no one was looking, I leaned the weight of my body against a coconut tree and cried. I wrote about how my friends chatted somewhere behind me, how I stood on the sponge soft grass along the pond, directly where my great-grandmother had once stood, content and smiling as she tossed bread. I looked at the ducks circling, granddaughter ducks, maybe. I wrote it all down, how my partner had taken me on grandma's tour of the island twice now, how I think I fell in love with him more each day, with every story he told, how he learned Hawaiian words in kindergarten, how he understood at a young age he was a guest on this island. I relaxed the wall I had learned to construct around my heart, specifically around white men who have the capacity to vanish things. He told me stories of schoolyard fights and how he learned to be quiet, how to behave on land that doesn't belong to you. You'd get pounded for that, he'd say, about boys in his grade who came from California and tried to take up too much space. Posted up on the beach as he surfed, I felt grateful for him. I was grateful for the quiet, for the solitude. He knew the stories that looped in my head, and he knew how badly I needed to write them down. I wrote poems for my great-grandmother, for my ancestors. I wrote poems about land back decolonization and cultural revitalization. I wrote a poem about salmon for my friend Tay because the sun and the beach made me miss her. Tay and I met when she was visiting from New Zealand. She was on her West Coast book tour and stayed with me at my home in Tacoma. We had done several book festivals and readings together, and in her, I had found a kindred spirit. Together, we showed up at author after parties, feeling out of place. We showed up in lace and latex, in boots and lip gloss, hovering over the free snacks, wondering if it was just us or were the other riders not talking to us. Maybe they're just scared of us. Indigenous women riders, and we laughed and filled our plates with fish and drank free Chardonnay before taking a lift to the punk club. We did oyster shooters in Port Townsend, and when I showed her a Coast Salish carving, she whipped around to show me the back of her sweatshirt, adorned in Maori art. Look at the similarities. And we both smiled because, of course, there were similarities. On her last week in the Pacific Northwest, Tay visited my class at the Native Pathways program at Evergreen State College. The students lit up in her presence, ignited by her laugh, her words, and the simple way she spoke truths about indigeneity, trauma, and resilience. Out on the stairwell, we both took puffs off our nicotine vapes after class. It's exhausting being inspiring, being strong. As we puffed clouds of strawberry and mango out into the northwest drizzle, Tay broke the quiet rhythm of inhale, exhale. What is that? She asked, and her head tilted toward a large wooden structure ahead of us. I admitted I didn't know. It looks Maori, she responded. So together we trekked in the rain, down the stairs and up to the building. The weaving studio was a collaboration between two Native artists. One was Coast Salish, the other Maori. We approached the building, exchanging glances. The woodwork that adorned the structure was half her culture and half mine. There were figures in the wood. It was hard to distinguish the different styles, the overlap in our tribe's aesthetics. We circled the studio in opposite directions, eyeing the story carved in both Maori and Lushootseed. Even the figures of the pillars shared the same abalone eyes. We met in the middle. It's us, my friend exclaimed. This building is us. And as we embraced, we laughed. We wiped tears from our eyes. Thank you. Opening it up to Q&A. Yep. Questions? Thoughts?
I'd like to ask.
You can ask me anything, almost anything. I should be careful with that, but yeah.
Jackie. Yeah.
Thank you.
Should I go straight into this one? No. So when did you begin writing?
Hmm.
And like, I guess two questions, if I can take. When did you begin writing for yourself? And when did you begin creative writing with poetry?
Mhm. I love this question and thank you for asking because it's rare that you can find that one moment, right? In whatever kind of art we do or the work we do in our lives. I don't know, for me, I'm like, whoa, this is rare that I can just pinpoint it to an exact moment, but I can. It was during a challenging time in my life. I was a child. I was probably 13 or 14, and I had run away from home again, and I was on a Greyhound bus to Seattle. Like I left Swinomish, hitchhiked, got to Mount Vernon, and was like, I'm getting on a bus, I'm going to Seattle where it's cool. And then I got on the bus and I started having, I didn't know it at the time, what was a panic attack. I was like, what is this? What's going on? And the only thing I could think of was a teacher I had met at the alternative high school I would eventually drop out of, told me about Sylvia Plath and this quote from her that said, I write because there's a voice inside me that won't be still. And as I was experiencing a panic attack for the first time, that was in my head. And I remember tearing through my backpack and looking for paper or notebook. I didn't have anything like that. And I found a napkin. And for the rest of the hour ride, I just covered every inch of that napkin in words and story and like terrible teenage poetry. But it soothed me. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, this is the thing. Like, this is something that not only do I want to do and feel called to do, but like it literally is helping me and saving me. And so that's when I was like, I'm a writer. I want to be a writer. I have to be a writer. There's nothing else I can do. But then the second part of your question, creative writing, that happened when I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts and had my first creative writing class and was like, oh, wait a minute, I could actually do this. Like people would care about a book from me. So yeah, thank you for that question.
I'm noisy, you know, okay, you're good. I'm curious about your background. You mentioned the Nooksack, and I lived in Whatcom County for a few years, and where exactly are your people up there?
Well, if Nooksack is outside of Everson, yeah, so that's where the
And then you
Nooksack is.
mentioned
Upper Skagit. I grew up in Swinomish. That's because the dad who raised me, my mom eventually remarried a Swinomish man, and they raised us out there.
And where did you go to school after you dropped out of high school?
Nowhere.
Really?
I actually literally danced burlesque and belly dance and performed with circus folks for a while until I made the decision for about 5 years until I made the decision to go to IA in Santa Fe. So there was a big break. I left school as a teenager and got a job and an apartment in Seattle and just started kind of making my way. And then there was a moment, like a crossroads moment, where this circus performing troupe said, do you want to go on tour with us? And I was like, yes, yes, I do. Literally run away and join the circus. But then that's when my grandparents had given me a pamphlet for the Institute of American Indian Arts. And so I have these two, I'm like, circus or school? I chose school. Yeah.
I actually picked up your book because I had never seen the words coaches punk put together. So that was pretty badass for me to see. Picked up the LaPointe books in Seattle.
I love LaPointe.
Awesome.
I love it. It's one of my favorite stories.
And I guess I was curious if you had seen any intersection between the punk scene and Coast culture, like Indigenous culture.
For a long time, no. And there's an essay about that in Thundersong. And I think in Red Paint, I talk a lot about that. I have a conflicting, and I think that's okay. I think it's allowed to be both. I have a lot of love and admiration for that scene, for holding me, for having a place to land as a misfit, displaced person. As a teenager, I think we gravitate towards things like punk and that kind of culture for a reason. And in a lot of ways, it really held me up and introduced me to my chosen family. And I met other, wild ass artists and queer folks and punks and was like, yes. But then I started to notice as I grew older, out of teenagehood into my 20s, I would look around the room and I was like, there's not a single other Native person in this room. And it started freaking me out.
Yeah.
And there's a whole essay about it in that, but in Thundersong. But I do see overlap now. And I think that it's shifting and changing in a way that is really beautiful and really exciting. I see Indigenous punk bands now. I see, I was just listening to Snotty Nose Res Kids on the way here, and they're so punk. I know they're a rap group, but they're punk. So yeah, I do see that shifting, and I think that there's overlap. One of my favorite questions of all time was, and it relates to yours. Someone said, you have the word, Coast Salish punk in your memoir title. How would you relate that to your great grandmother, who's so important to you and was such an inspiration? And I was like, oh my God, this is a challenging question, but also really important. And it's hard for me to separate, in thinking about that for the first time, I was like, well, our great grandma went around and saw the importance of fighting against erasure and oppression in a way to she was like, oh, this language is literally not being spoken. We have to figure this out. I'm going to do work. She committed, half of her life to trying to preserve that. That's so punk. So, yeah. Yes, please.
So I'm a Native woman, and I feel like that you have accomplished so many intersectionalities in a very beautiful way. And for me, it's just it's inspiring to see how as Native peoples, one, we were forced through colonization to adapt this writing style, where traditionally our stories and our histories are told orally. And so that's one intersection, but then also how you have been so vulnerable within your work, and it's been so personal, and real. But then we also, like, as Native people, have this history of boarding schools, where we have these silent generations where we're not supposed to talk about trauma, we're not supposed to talk about feelings. And how has that been for you to battle these intersectionalities? Because like traditionally, we're supposed to be able to talk about these things with our community, but then, as what colonization has brought on and racism.
Yeah, that's so, and again, great question, because you're right. And I think that there is we don't talk about that. Like there's a part of that, like specifically around generational trauma, historical trauma, boarding school history, all of these things. So I feel like I have come into like confrontation with what you're talking about, and it has been challenging, but I also feel really grateful that I had a good model for it growing up. Like my great grandmother also was a fierce woman, and I never just want to be like, I'm gonna spill my trauma tea all over and be like, oh, like, no, there's some, like, I want to write stories that challenge the trauma narrative and bring like, if there's a thing as, if, there's such a thing as intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, isn't there also intergenerational and historical resilience and strength? And I think that she was my first model for that, because she was a badass, an incredible, powerful woman, but also wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. Like I saw that woman cry in public a lot, and it was crazy awesome. I was like, whoa. But then she would do that. She would share and get like kind of overwhelmed by a story or whatever she was sharing, and then compose herself. And like, that was my first model of that. And we're allowed to be both. I do think that it's tricky. And I'm excited for, younger generations to keep following in that and be like, we can talk about these things because we have to. In fact, Tay Tibble and I on this tour, we're talking a lot about the generational weight and the trauma we carry literally in our DNA, but also combating that with strength and honoring where we come from and celebrating it. She has this poem in her new book called My Ancestors Ride With Me. And it's like, to me, like captures that, where it's like, yes, we have these layers. We're talking about trauma, we're talking about vulnerability, but we're doing it from a place of power because we have to.
So I guess that ties all back together, the idea of it being and the idea of reclaiming space and using narrative. You're using language in both a way that is yours and not yours. It's something that you grew up with, and access as someone who lives in the 21st century of the United States of America. Unfortunately, the history that we live with as people who all come from different places, different spaces, different areas, you're never really entirely where you're from. I mean, some people are lucky and that's the thing that they experience, but so I guess by speaking it and by writing in both your native language and in English, you're doing something that is and how, I guess I didn't have a question. My question was like, how does your family approach this? How do they approach you speaking about something that is not just yours, but theirs? Both found in knowledge.
Oh, I gotta ask a lot of permission.
Yeah.
I believe, like my mom and I, it's always scary. I'm like, we have to go on a walk, Mom. We go on lots of walks together. We live for the first time in many years, very close proximity. I can walk to my mom's house in 3.5 minutes. It's wild. But we go on a lot of walks, and even with like all throughout Red Paint and even Thunder Song, we would go on walks, and I was like, I have to share this with you. I want you to read it. Like I wait for permission. Like I never want to. I think we have a responsibility as like younger generations to like honor and carry our ancestors in a way, yeah, that honors them. And so my mom definitely vetoed some things, and not personal things, not like, oh, you can't write about that one time we got in a fight. It's more about like, yeah, the cultural like respect. Yeah.
Some things you can share and some things you're trying to feel from, like at what level does it come from? At what cost? And it's not just you, it is there's more than
Yeah.
just the author.
I I think every other Indigenous writer that I know and talk with comes up against this all the time. And it's important. It'd be weird if we didn't, if we're just like blindly charging ahead, like whatever, like that's not right. Yeah.
You mentioned Sylvia Plath. I know that writers are readers, truly, they're avid, they generally sometimes read a lot of great writing, so it helps them form their ideas. What other authors?
I love this question. Thank you. Because I feel like I turn into a nerdy cheerleader about the authors I love. So this is one of my favorite questions. But some of the top hits, the bangers, I read a lot of other Indigenous authors, but across genre. Like I read poetry, I read nonfiction, I read novels. One of my favorite novels of all time is by Kavai Strong Washburn. It's called Sharks in the Time of Saviors, and it's a novel that follows, it's like a polyphonic novel that follows 4 different family members, this Native Hawaiian family in growing up on the Big Island, and it's beautiful. And this book, I read it like once a year. I had the privilege of like teaching it recently. It's one of my favorites. I also read another one of my favorite like bangers is Deborah Miranda's Bad Indians. It's a lyric memoir and it's stunning. It's hard. I always feel weird when I recommend it too, because I'm like, I cried like 800 times during this book. So it feels weird to be like, please read this, but it is important and it's powerfully written and beautifully done. And was honestly one of the first examples of, oh, you don't have to write a certain way. Like our stories are not linear. You don't have to like adhere to these rules around traditional narratives. Like she's telling a story in a very beautiful lyrical way. So that, who else am I reading? It's called Bad Indians. Yeah. And then poets I read, like Tay Tibble, who I've been cheerleading for an hour now, but also Tommy Pico is an incredible Native poet who I just got to do a reading with in LA. Some of my favorite work. Who else do I read? Oh, Quentin Baker is a local or Seattle poet who wrote a beautiful book called Ballast. I read a lot of like queer and Indigenous BIPOC authors because I think that those stories are really important and I resonate with. Deborah Erling Magpie wrote a book called Permared that I really loved. She's Indigenous. She's from Montana. It's a beautiful book. It's a hard book too. I'm like, do I have any happy books? Surely I do.
Are you familiar with the work of Mitchell Jackson?
No.
He is an author from Portland, Oregon, and I got turned on to his writing because there's generational, he's Black. He grew up in Portland, and the first line in his first book was, I grew up in the whitest city in America. I was like, that's it, that's my book.
Period. Yes, like Portland.
Really dealt with like a lot of the things that Indigenous.
Yeah, I think that's another reason why you should check out Ballast by Quentin Baker. Amazing. Another Black poet whose voice is incredible, who they're so very talented poet. But I think that whenever we talk and share poems, there's something like what you were speaking to, like there's something relatable. Yeah.
Well, I find that people of color who are authors generally want their need is to give something to uplift their community. And he's
Right. I will check him out. Thank you. There was a question in the back. Yes, hi.
What would you say like young writers like that are like still trying to start their writing?
Yeah, I think that, and this is, I feel like I go hard. I feel very privileged, to be honest, to be able to teach at a place like Native Pathways program where I get to you know, occasionally be in conversation with emerging writers, you know, like students in their undergrad who are just kind of messing around with poems and are like, I don't know. And I get so jazzed about it. I'm like, this is beautiful. I'll spend like, my partner was like, you just took like 2.5 hours on one essay. Can you like, this isn't sustainable. And I was like, but it's because it's so good. And it's one of my favorite things to encourage and uplift voices. And I think some of my advice is always to like, let yourself, remind yourself that your voice and story matters. Because I think that, at least from a personal experience when I was younger and just exploring and experimenting with writing, it was like, oh, I don't have anything to say. It's one of my, it breaks my heart when I hear young writers say, well, I haven't done anything, or I haven't like lived a life, or like why does my story or my voice count? And it's like, it does though. We need y'all's voice. So my biggest advice is to remind yourself that no matter what your story is, if you're writing like post-apocalyptic sci-fi or poetry or creative nonfiction, that your voice matters and is needed in the world. And to read a lot, like read stuff. Like that's how people are like, you dropped out of alternative high school. How are you? And I was like, I read a lot.
You write every day, or do you need to like take breaks and take a step back when you write something?
Also, I admire writers that have that like rigid practice. I always wish I've tried multiple times in my life to be like, yes, I wake up, I make my tea, it's 7 a.m., we're gonna write. No, I can't do that. I've tried. I admire writers who can do that. And I think it's important to give ourselves breaks. Like there's nothing worse than, and I've experienced this recently, I think due to being really busy, like our lives get busy, whether it's our family and community or whatever, like work stuff, like sometimes we don't just have the space. Like it's a luxury to sit down and be like, I'm gonna tell this story. Like, and I love it and it's a beautiful luxury, but sometimes we're not always afforded that. And to let yourself walk away from it. I think when I was really struggling before red paint became a thing in the world, I had this failed manuscript that people were interested in it. It was like 500 pages. It was ridiculous. Little Boats, you know, the first memoir, publishers and agents were like, we're interested, but it kept getting rejected over and over. And life was happening to me. I was going through some challenging moments. And I think the biggest thing that I could do for myself was to take a break and walk away for like a year. Like I like joined a band and like just was a waitress and a bartender, you know, like I was just like, okay, I'm gonna step away from that, and to allow ourselves the permission to do that like is so important, because we're constantly told you have to create and do things, or so that was a big lesson. And also it still comes up in my life all the time. Like I was just joking with the poet who I told y'all about, who I hope you check out, Quentin Baker, but I was like, I haven't written a poem in 3 months. And they were like, it's cool, you will again. But there's nothing worse that in that 3 months, I would try, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna write a poem. And it was really clunky. And like, I felt like it wasn't coming. And I think that the best thing to do is to trust that it will come back. But that's different for every writer. For me, I'm like, okay, I wanna write a poem about orcas. I've written 6 of them. This one's not coming. I'm just gonna take a break and do something else.